Frost covered the concrete in a thin white film, crunching under boots as the crew moved toward the enormous delta-shaped aircraft waiting at the far edge of the pan. Even from a distance, the Vulcan didn't look like a bomber. It looked like a creature crouched in the darkness, wings stretched wide, its presence both intimidating and strangely beautiful under the sweeping beams of the floodlights. The men approaching it spoke softly, not because anyone demanded it, but because the aircraft itself seemed to demand a certain respect. Inside the crew building moments earlier, the silence had been worse than the cold outside. The alert had not sounded yet, but every man felt it hanging in the air like pressure before a storm. Someone tapped a pen against a metal table. Someone else stared at a checklist he had already memorized years ago. Every eye flicked toward the red light above the door, the one that could erupt into noise at any second. When the klaxon finally screamed, the sound tore through the stillness so violently that the walls seemed to vibrate. Chairs toppled, men grabbed flight bags, and boots hammered down the hallway in a coordinated rush. Born from endless repetition, no one shouted commands. There was no need. Every movement was automatic, drilled into them through years of practice. The cold night air hit hard as they burst outside. Their breath fogged instantly. The Vulcan waited under the lights, its shadow stretching long across the concrete. Climbing the ladder into the cockpit felt like entering the heart of a machine that had been asleep but listening. Inside, dim red lights glowed, illuminating switches, cables, and the narrow passageway that led to the rear crew positions. The hatch sealed with a metallic clunk that shut out the world behind them. The pilot settled into his seat, strapping in as the co-pilot flipped the first sequence of switches. Behind them, the navigator and radar operator slid into their own dimly lit spaces, surrounded by glowing screens and humming electronics. The first engine start came with a low, rumbling vibration that crawled through the floor panels. The second engine joined it, then the third, and finally, the fourth. Each one added a new layer of thunder until the entire cockpit shook with raw mechanical power. Outside, loose frost skittered across the ground as if fleeing the noise. The Vulcan taxied forward, its wide wings almost brushing the edges of the taxiway. The crew felt every bump and jolt through the controls. At the runway threshold, the pilot held the brakes and advanced the throttles. The Olympus engines roared with a deep, primal fury, the kind of sound that could be felt in the chest more than heard. The aircraft strained against the brakes like a powerful animal waiting to be released. When the brakes came off, the Vulcan surged forward with startling force. The runway lights streaked past the canopy, the nose lifted, and with smooth, heavy heave, the delta wing caught the air. The ground fell away beneath them. They climbed into the night, engines burning bright, leaving the quiet airfield shrinking behind them. And though this was only another drill, each man felt the same silent truth pressing in. Everything they practiced was meant for a moment no one wanted to see. The responsibility rode with them into the sky. Once the Vulcan climbed above the scattered cloud layers, the night opened around them in vast silence. Below, the world blurred into faint pockets of light, tiny clusters of towns separated by long stretches of empty countryside. At altitude, the aircraft felt smoother, more alive, its giant delta wing carrying it forward with a steady confidence. The crew settled into the rhythm they knew so well. The navigator unfolded maps and checked coordinates, adjusting their planned route to match the simulated threat environment. The radar operator leaned over his glowing display, watching for simulated interceptors or enemy radar sweeps. The pilots kept their eyes on the instruments, feeling the slightest shifts in vibration through their seats. Even during a drill, their bodies reacted as if the danger were real. These missions demanded absolute focus, because mistakes up here meant more than embarrassment. They meant catastrophe. Tonight's scenario required them to practice a long-range penetration at low level. Once clear of the initial climb, the pilot pushed the nose forward and the Vulcan began its descent. The engines howled as the bomber dropped from the high, thin air into the denser atmosphere below. Clouds tore past the canopy. The sudden turbulence jolted them, rattling panels and making pens roll in their holders. The altimeter spun downward until the bomber leveled off, just a few hundred feet above the ground. This was where the Vulcan transformed from a calm giant into a predator. Flying at low level at nearly 500 knots required instinct as much as training. The delta wing flexed in the turbulent air, responding with surprising agility. The crew felt every movement, every bump, every gust, every micro-adjustment from the pilot's hands. The darkness outside made it even more intense. Hills, valleys, and rivers flashed beneath them, unseen shapes whipping past in the shadows. To avoid enemy radar, the Vulcan hugged the terrain so closely that the ground seemed to reach up toward them. The pilot scanned the instruments constantly while glancing at the flickering outlines beyond the canopy. The radar altimeter became their lifeline, its rapid readouts announcing how close the Vulcan flew to the Earth. Low-level flight was exhausting in a way no one outside the cockpit could truly understand. The constant noise, the vibration, the pressure of knowing that one miscalculation could end everything. Yet the crew moved with practiced efficiency. This was the mission the Vulcan had been built for, to slip beneath enemy defenses, strike deep, and escape before a response could form. Hours of low-level navigation tested them, but the machine never faltered. Once the simulated target approached, tension sharpened in the cockpit. The bomb aimer prepared the release sequence, calling out adjustments through the intercom. The pilot held the Vulcan steady, lining up perfectly with the imaginary point on the ground. Then, at the exact second, the simulated payload was released. A moment later, the pilot pulled the aircraft into a steep climbing turn, engines screaming as they pushed away from the target. Even though nothing real had dropped, the surge of adrenaline was undeniable. Every man aboard knew that in a real mission, that climb would determine whether they lived or died. As they leveled off again and began the long journey home, the night outside seemed quieter than before, almost respectful. They flew on through the darkness, each minute stretching into the next, as the engines droned with unwavering force. Fatigue pressed at the edges of their focus, but none dared relax. Every crew member remained locked into their task, hands steady, eyes scanning, minds alert to anything unusual. Even in training, the Vulcan demanded respect. It was powerful, but power came with consequences. As they approached friendly airspace once more, tension slowly eased. Lights of distant towns flickered below, soft and peaceful, compared to the brutal scenarios they had just rehearsed. The pilot trimmed the aircraft, letting it breathe a little as the engine settled into a calmer tone. The navigator folded away his final maps and gave a quiet nod to the captain, confirming they were on course for home. The return flight always carried a strange mixture of relief and reflection. They had completed the mission, but tomorrow another drill awaited. Another simulation of a war they prayed would never ignite. Dawn crept slowly over the airbase as the Vulcan returned, the first hints of pale light brushing the horizon, while the bomber rolled to a halt on the dispersal pan. The crew stepped down the ladder with stiff legs and heavy eyes, their bodies drained from hours of tension and noise. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, touching panels, checking sensors, preparing it for the next flight. Even before the engines fully cooled for the Vulcan force, rest was temporary. Readiness was constant. Inside the debrief room, the men removed helmets and gloves, rubbing warmth back into their fingers as they sat at the long metal table. The air smelled of coffee, oil, and overheated electronics. Officers moved along the rows gathering details, marking every flicker on radar screens, every turbulence spike, every deviation in the flight plan. These drills were not simply repetitions, they were rehearsals for a mission that could one day be real. The Vulcan carried Britain's nuclear deterrent, a responsibility heavier than any bomber before it. In the early Cold War, the threat of nuclear conflict felt brutally real, and the Vulcan stood as the spear point of the nation's defense. At first, altitude was its shield. The bomber could climb above 60,000 feet, beyond the reach of most fighters and early missile systems. But technology evolved quickly. Soviet defenses improved. High-altitude flight grew too dangerous, and the Vulcan force adapted. Low-level flight became the new doctrine, and with it came an entirely different world of challenges. Training missions now involved weaving through valleys, skimming ridgelines, and racing across open plains at reckless speeds. Pilots learned to judge terrain by instinct, sensing changes in wind and pressure before instruments confirmed them. The delta wing that once ruled the stratosphere now carved through turbulent low air with surprising agility. The crew felt every movement, every jolt, every gust, every second where the ground loomed too close. The intercom buzzed with calm, clipped voices calling out headings, altitudes, and corrections, masking the constant intensity each man felt. Bonds formed in these hours. In tight cockpit spaces, separated but connected by intercom and trust, friendships solidified under pressure. They shared jokes during long climbs, steady silence during dangerous descents, and a mutual understanding that no one else could fully comprehend. One mistake from any position, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, radar operator, could destroy them all. Yet they flew with quiet confidence, each man trusting the others as completely as the aircraft itself. The most haunting truth they carried was the nature of the mission. If the alert ever represented a real launch, the flight they initiated might be one-way nuclear strike profiles offered no guarantee of return. They practiced escape routes, emergency procedures, and bailout sequences, but deep down, they knew the truth. A real launch signal meant the world behind them might already be collapsing. Families, towns, entire cities could vanish before they even reached their target. Still, they trained, not because they wanted the mission, but because they understood that preparation was what prevented it. The Vulcan became more than a bomber. It became a living symbol of deterrence. Its very presence whispered a warning across the world. Any attack would be met with devastating force. This grim balance kept a fragile peace intact. The crews felt the weight of that purpose every time their boots touched the ladder. They were not preparing to start a war. They were preparing to stop one. On clear days, the Vulcan looked almost serene. Sunlight glinted off its white anti-flash paint, giving it a ghost-like shine against the sky. Crowds at air displays stared in awe as the massive delta wing lifted smoothly from the runway, climbing steep and fast, while the four engines thundered in perfect synchronization. Children covered their ears, adults felt the vibration in their ribs, and everyone watched as the bomber arced overhead with impossible grace for something so large. But beneath the spectacle lay a sobering truth. The Vulcan was built in a world teetering on the edge. It was powerful, urgent, and always alert. Training continued through long nights and early mornings, through fatigue and weather and the relentless demand for perfection. The Vulcan required discipline, but it rewarded mastery with a feeling few aircraft could offer. Each completed mission strengthened their resolve. They felt connected to something larger than themselves, a shield stretched across a nation that relied on their skill and readiness every single day. As the years progressed, the Vulcan force entered its most intense period of Cold War operations. Tensions rose and fell unpredictably, and every crew lived with the understanding that they could be launched into the sky at a moment's notice. QRA, Quick Reaction Alert, became a way of life. Crews slept in flight suits, boots placed neatly beside beds, gear ready in lockers that could be opened in a single motion. The klaxon was both feared and respected. It could sound during dinner, during sleep, during a quiet moment of reading, and within seconds, the base erupted into motion. Trucks roared to life, floodlights snapped on, and men sprinted toward their aircraft in a coordinated blur. The Vulcan, silent one moment, became a thunderous monster the next, as its engines ignited with raw, chest-shaking power. Every alert, even drills, sent adrenaline surging through veins. The possibility of a real launch was always present, threading through every scramble like a shadow. The aircraft itself evolved to face new threats. Electronic countermeasures grew more sophisticated, allowing the Vulcan to blind, confuse, or evade enemy radar. Pods were fitted beneath the wings, filled with jammers, chaff dispensers, and systems designed to turn the bomber into a ghost on Soviet screens. Crews practiced complex maneuvers, switching frequencies, deploying countermeasures, and flying unpredictable paths to outsmart defenses. The Vulcan was large, but in the right hands it became remarkably elusive. Radar operators inside the aircraft learned to read the faintest distortions on their displays, sensing danger before the instruments confirmed it. Their warnings guided the pilots through invisible threats that could destroy them long before they saw an enemy. Low-level operations remained the most demanding element of their training. Flying a bomber of this size at treetop height required absolute precision. There was no room for error. The ground rushed beneath them in a blur, ridgelines leaping toward the canopy as the Vulcan skimmed past wind shear, turbulence, and sudden terrain shifts kept the crew constantly alert. One misjudged turn, one late reaction, and the aircraft could break apart in seconds. Yet the Vulcan thrived at low level. Its delta wing rode the heavy air with surprising stability, absorbing turbulence that would rattle smaller aircraft into submission. The pilots trusted that wing with their lives, and it carried them through environments no bomber had been expected to survive. Even quiet stretches carried tension. On long transits across the sea, with nothing but black water below, the crew slipped into a focused rhythm. The engines hummed steadily, instruments glowed, and the outside world seemed far away. But they knew every flight was preparation. For a moment, none of them wanted to face. If the order ever came, they would be delivering a weapon capable of reshaping continents. They practiced escapes they might never survive, plotted routes that might not exist after the strike. and rehearsed procedures that would be used only once before the world changed forever. Despite the weight of responsibility, pride ran deep among Vulcan crews. They accepted the burden and carried out their missions with unwavering professionalism. And in time, the bomber designed for nuclear war would find itself thrust into a very different conflict, a conventional war in a remote part of the world where the Vulcan would again be called upon not as a symbol of deterrence, but as a weapon of precision and endurance. That conflict would force the Vulcan into challenges no one predicted. Its systems, aging yet reliable, would be tested on missions far longer than anything in its design profile. Refueling plans, navigation techniques, and coordination between aircraft would push the limits of Cold War aviation. The bomber that once stood ready for nuclear war would soon fly into one of the most daring long-range operations in history. What awaited it was not a drill, not a simulation, but a real mission demanding precision, courage, and endurance on a scale few aircraft had faced. Yet for the Vulcan crews, impossibility had never been a deterrent. They had trained for the unimaginable, and now they would prove what the aircraft could truly achieve. Readied.OK. The call for the Vulcan to enter real combat came in 1982, when a distant conflict ignited in the South Atlantic. Argentina had seized the Falkland Islands, and Britain prepared a response. But the islands lay 8,000 miles from home, far beyond the reach of any bomber Britain had ever sent into battle. The Vulcan, long considered close to retirement, was suddenly thrust back into relevance. Its crews were asked to attempt the impossible, strike a runway on the far side of the world using an aircraft designed for Cold War missions over Europe. This operation would become known as Black Buck. The first and greatest challenge was refueling. No Vulcan could fly to the Falklands and return without an airborne network of tankers. The solution was a complex chain of Victor refueling aircraft stretching across the South Atlantic. Tankers would refuel tankers, which would refuel other tankers, which finally would refuel the lone Vulcan committed to the strike. The plan was fragile, intricate, and unprecedented. One mistake anywhere in the chain could doom the mission. Crew training began immediately. Old equipment was pulled from storage. Refueling probes were reinstalled, some hastily welded after years of disuse. Engineers worked around the clock to modify the aircraft for conventional bombing. Meanwhile, the crews practiced long-duration flights, oceanic navigation, brutal low-level approaches, and fuel transfers performed in turbulence and darkness. There was no margin for error. When the night of the mission arrived, tension crackled through the airbase. The Vulcan stood on the runway, loaded with 21,000 pounds of bombs. Its crew climbed aboard, knowing the flight ahead would push both man and machine to their limits. They took off under cover of darkness, engines roaring as the Delta Wing lifted them skyward. Behind them, a fleet of Victor tankers followed, each one playing a vital role in the fragile choreography of fuel and distance. Hours into the mission, the first refueling began. Turbulence slammed the aircraft as the Vulcan extended its probe toward the tanker's drogue. The slightest misalignment could snap the probe or rip the drogue apart. Sweat beaded on foreheads as the pilots held formation with absolute focus. The connection latched, fuel surged, and the Vulcan pushed on toward the next link in the chain. More refuelings followed, each one draining another Victor of fuel and tightening the mission's margin of survival. Approaching the Falklands, weather worsened, winds strengthened and clouds thickened, obscuring radar returns. The Vulcan descended toward low altitude, engines howling as it approached the attack point. The crew counted down to release, every correction critical. Then, at the exact moment, the bombs fell. The aircraft jolted as its payload released, climbing sharply to escape. Behind them, explosions carved a long scar across the runway. There was no time to celebrate. Fuel was dangerously low. They climbed back toward the refueling zone, scanning for the waiting victor. When contact was made and fuel began flowing, relief washed over the cockpit. But the mission wasn't done. A failure in the refueling probe forced the Vulcan to divert to Brazil. Escorted by fighters, the bomber landed with almost no fuel remaining. Diplomatic negotiations settled the incident, and the crew eventually returned home. Operation Black Buck proved the Vulcan's capability beyond doubt. It showed that determination, training, and human resolve could push an aging aircraft far beyond its intended limits. The missions were risky, controversial, and astonishing in their ambition, yet they succeeded, writing one of the most remarkable chapters in aviation history. For the crews, Black Buck became proof that everything they had trained for, every drill, every scramble, every hour spent mastering the aircraft, had prepared them for this moment. It was a final demonstration of the Vulcan's strength and the dedication of the men who flew it. Even as the Vulcan aged, their spirit never faltered. Their resolve carried the aircraft across oceans, into danger, and ultimately into history. Thanks so much for listening and watching my content. I hope you really enjoyed. Hope to see you in the next video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn post notifications on.